I'm gonna start recording because I just think everything that you do is so fun and I don't want to miss any of
Oh
it.
no.
But you're still repping the Raptors and everything.
Still doing it. Yeah. I can take off the hat for the video,
No,
but
no.
I got hat hair.
I'll
Let's
send
go team.
Raptors
Let's go
a
team.
message and see if they'll sponsor my video.
Hey, coffee nerds. So, no, the Toronto Raptors did not end up sponsoring this video, but my good friend Cole Torode from Rosso Coffee Roasters was still gracious enough to sit down and share his ton of knowledge on experimental fermentations in coffee. He's also a world barista competitor and a two-time world barista champion in Canada, Canadian world barista champion. So let's just say he has tried some crazy coffees. And by the way, this is the third video of a three-part series that I'm doing all about experimental fermentation. So the first two, I interviewed Lucia Solis, who is a coffee processing specialist, and also Samuel Ronson, who is a coffee producer from Mexico. So if you haven't checked those out, I'll leave a link right here. But in the meantime, let's dive right in. Experimental fermentations in coffee with Cole Torode.
And also, I remember reading in Standard magazine featuring you basically, and did an interview with you, and you spoke a little bit about experimental fermentations, how it kind of your perspective as a roaster, and you've actually brought in a lot of these different types of coffee to showcase to the Canadian audience. So basically, I'd love to get your perspective on where do you see this going and how do your current customers receive it?
So the bulk of the coffees that you just referenced that I am bringing in are actually going to other roasters. Rogue Wave, The Library, Seth Taylor, Coffee by Design. Some of the clients I'm selling to are going to be clients in a cafe setting. Some of them are going to be roasters. So in this context with Sammy's Coffee and a lot of these sort of experimental lots, they're going to roasters. And at least the feedback I get from those roasters into their markets are these coffees are wild. People love them. They want more of them. They're so much more than just coffee.
Your customers are not only the people who walk into your Rosso locations, but
yeah, and I think at least the trend or the pattern that I'm finding, the people that get a lot and a lot in Sammy's context is 15 kilos. The people who kind of commit to 15 kilos usually come back and they're like, I got to have something like this on the menu, because there's a small sector of their clientele that wants that. They want the non-traditional, the big, loud, explosive fruit bomb, Ethiopian natural on steroids kind of thing is what I think most of Sammy's coffees are like. They're big, expressive, aromatic. They are not coffees you want to drink all day, every day. They are, special moment coffees that we can sort of sip and savor and look into a corner really mindfully and not get disrupted. Like those are his coffees. In my opinion, at least, they're more so built for barista competitions or different coffee competitions, or like that high-end slot on a pour-over menu or a reserve, reserve menu or whatever in a cafe. That's, I think, where his coffees fit. But I think because of COVID, it's become more accessible in the market because these coffees exist, but the competition outlet at least does not. So a lot of these coffees are getting funneled into menus. Most of the people I've spoken to are moving these high-end coffees like crazy. And I mean, I'm saying crazy like they're moving truckloads of it, but they're moving kilos of it, which a year ago we would not have anticipated that, somebody could sell out of 100-pound coffee just in a pre-order and sell 20 kilos, which I just had a conversation with somebody that did exactly that. And like, I think that's pretty special.
that's very special. Yeah, that kind of goes into a little bit of my next question here, because when you say experimental fermentation, it almost has that same resonance maybe as if someone says natural wine. It's like people don't quite know exactly how to define it, even though it can be defined. It's hard to kind of in one word encapsulate it. And obviously people have very different opinions about it as well.
Yeah.
Whether it's wine or whether it's coffee. And I'd be curious to know, opinions aside, where do you see this movement into more experimental fermentations and these kind of experimental lots going in the future, given the trend that specialty coffee or coffee in general has to swing back and forth and find sort of an equilibrium throughout different waves?
I think right now as an industry, we're just bracketing it all as experimental. If it doesn't fall into a traditional natural honey or washed process, or maybe CM, CM's maybe its own category now. If it doesn't fall into one of those four things, it's experimental. It's not traditional as we know traditional. So, Sammy's coffee he's been doing this for, I think, 3 years now. He's been playing with fermentation and the effects that it has on his 1200 meter red Bourbon. And I would say, I would say he's past the point of us labeling it experimental. It's not an experiment anymore. He's successful. That is now a recipe, baby. Like he's got a new process. He's got a handful, and I think we need to be careful in labeling something experimental, because to the consumer that means it's not refined. It's not fully researched. It's not ready for market, is the way I hear experimental. Like I'm envisioning a science kid in the 5th grade with a volcano and it's erupting and he's sitting there like, oh shit. That's what I think of when I hear experimental. That's not Sammy producing coffee. That might be a lot here or a lot there that doesn't do what he thinks it's going to do. That I would say is an experiment. But I think at this point, it's now a process. He hasn't labeled it as, this is process 1. And then process 1 is this step by step. And that's how he executes on this particular type of process. And that's how he wants the flavors to showcase. I think a good example of naming processes would be Finca Deborah, Jameson Savage. He's got, he's decided not to name his processes as natural or washed or washed carbonic maceration or whatnot. He's gone and he's named everything. Terroir, as an example, is the name of his traditional washed coffee. Terroir evokes the flavors of geisha that he's growing and the soil and his microclimate, right? And then he's got illumination is his washed carbonic maceration, because it's vibrant and light up your life. He's got afterglow is his traditional natural, because it's a long sweet finish that kind of leaves you a little lit up, and like he's gone and given these names to the coffees, maybe similar also to Luna, like renaming their different offerings to be something that's not so hyper specific about the nerdy details of the coffee that I think we spend so long geeking out on, and instead make it fun and playful and easy to remember. You drink a coffee called Illumination, I'm gonna remember that. That's a pretty special name for a coffee. Or raspberry waffle, yeah, I'm probably gonna remember that one too. I think, again, I'm running off with your question, but at some point we need to move away from the word experimental, defining all processes that utilize fermentation for more than just a vehicle to remove the mucilage.
Exactly. And that's a very interesting direction to kind of take this, because that does take it back to the communication. How are we communicating these fermentations, especially as they evolve from what was previously known in the beginning as being experimental into something where it's much more indicative and can define something, but then also taking it I don't know if it's one step further or in a different direction, as you mentioned, where you're giving liberty to each, let's say, artist, each producer in the chain to label it and to name it in a way that that they want to artistically. In that sense, it's
right.
It's not based on any sort of science, and whether it's the producer in their processing or the roaster in Luna's case and the roasting, and which also has to do with the processing. I love what you said about in Sam's case, where it's like it's beyond experimental. He's finished that experiment and has it dialed in. Do you see any sort of label coming to that as a way of kind of categorizing? Because we as humans, we like to label things, right? Because it's language. We like to have language to attribute to something to provide it meaning. And I think illumination is really cool. And yes, you're right. It conjures up these it's a brand. You know, when you think about a brand, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It just conjures up those images of a specific brand, of a product. But beyond that, I'm wondering if there's a way to kind of label things where it can be defined a little bit in lesser words than a whole document maybe explaining the process.
It's a good question, and I think it needs the document in a way, but in a way the document is going to hurt it so much, like in getting to market. So it's a weird, you know, we try to find line where we could just name it X and Sammy could sell it into market as X, but then a guy like yourself or me, we want to know what X means, right? And what is X process? And then a person, you know, like my mom just wants a cup of coffee. And if X is the one for her, cool. She doesn't really care if it was a 72-hour closed tank, cold fermentation in whole cherry that then was pulped after that fermentation. And like, she doesn't care. You and I geek out on it. If we want it to go to a more mass market that is outside of the 1% of 1% of coffee drinkers like yourself and I that are geeky, let's say, you know, if we want to get to more of a mass market, it needs to be something more approachable. And that's why I brought up Luna. I think they've really hit a home run with their cutesy, but also really defining names.
You're right. It actually really reminds me of coming back to marketing a little bit and communication, a brand that has done this very well, a brand that we all know very well, were some of the innovators when it comes to utilizing benefits and thinking about the end consumer rather than just outlining all the features and targeting people that way. So Apple, you know, when they first came out with the iPod, instead of doing what everyone else was doing in terms of, yeah, it's got an extra however many megabytes, I can't remember back then how many was like the cutting edge, but it was like you have 1,000 songs in your pocket. And that's all majority of the people who were listening to music cared about. And in terms of coffee, it's like we might be the people geeking out about the megabytes and like, you know, if it takes MP3 or .wav files or these different things, but majority of people are interested in like, does it taste like blueberry? Does it taste like some sort of rocket chip candy? Or does it taste like a molten lava cake? I'm interested in that. Or does it remind them of that? And maybe it's going to remind me of that, or maybe something else. So it's interesting.
Super interesting. But seeing as this conversation went quite a bit longer, I've decided to put the full uncut version of our chat onto my Patreon. So in the second half, Cole goes into some of the new processes that he's been receiving lately from places like Brazil, Colombia, Indonesia, and even some of the wacky fermentations that he's been trying, called the ice process, among others. So those are super cool. Cole was also generous enough to share some of his insights as a barista competitor and some of the new trends that he sees in the World Barista Championship, maybe even the role of specialty Robusta or other species. So, and as I mentioned, I haven't received any sponsorship for this video from the Raptors or from anyone else for that matter. So if you like what I'm up to on this channel, or you just want to see the second half of this video, I left a link down in the description to my Patreon page where you can sign up for a very accessible monthly rate. And this month in particular, I will be donating all of the proceeds from the Patreon to an organization called the World Coffee Research, who help out communities around the world with their production, their processing, really researching about coffee and how that can contribute to the communities all around the world. So if you want to be a part of that, that is what I'm going to do this month. If you enjoyed what Cole and I were talking about, or you've tried some really funky experimental fermentations, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. So just write down some of the coffees you've enjoyed recently, and it would be great if you could subscribe, because we're going to have some more of these types of conversations, some more coffee travels coming down the chute real soon. And in the meantime, thank you again, Cole.
Appreciate all your deep knowledge as usual. Totally.
So thanks for having me on to chat. I think it's fun to acknowledge that we don't know what we don't know, and there's lots to learn.
You heard it first, folks.